What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of, Reviews with Brando. I'm your host, Brando. This is a short form podcast and video series where I will review a new movie every week. It is technically a part of the podcast I do every Thursday, but I decided to carve a piece out for myself to A, make the podcast episode shorter, and B, because you know what? Probably shouldn't wait until Thursday to talk about a movie you saw over the weekend. Now, without further ado, I will get straight into the review. I saw The Call of the Wild, and man, it was not good. And based on the book of the same name, an abnormally large dog crosses paths with an aging drifter, setting up an adventure that changes both of their lives. Terry Notary as Buck, Harrison Ford as John Thornton, Dan Stevens as Hal, Omar Sy as Perrault, and Kara G as Francois. The pros: Harrison Ford's narration is effective. The writing and delivery of the lines do a good job of adding context to what is happening. So yes, I think, typically I think having a narrator is a little lazy because it makes it so, it can either be, lazy is not the right word. A narrator can either be heavy-handed and they're just reinforcing the things that we are already seeing and allowing us to have some extra perspective, maybe on how somebody's feeling about a thing or how they're seeing something. Or it can put you in a position where it makes it so that the writing of the actual scene itself is lacking a certain something, so that the narrator can come in and be like, oh, well, this and this is happening and here and here. And it's like, well, why wouldn't you just convey that? I don't need an exposition dump. But Harrison Ford has such a booming voice and has such a presence that I really liked what his narration added to the movie. And I looked forward to the scene transitions because I knew that we were one scene closer to hearing him talk again, and I liked that. I liked that his vibe that it added. Like he just, without seeing him on camera, he had this like elderly isn't the word I want to use. He had this wise cadence and this just you could hear the kind of the pain in his voice, but you could also hear that he's a man who's traveled many roads, seen many things, and even in all of his days, he still never quite saw anything like what he saw when Buck, the big-ass dog, at the center of the story, he never saw anything quite like the way his life was and the way he felt when he was around Buck, and I appreciated the nuance in that and the things that it added to the story overall. Another thing I really liked, Omar Sy, Harrison Ford, and Kara G are all great. Their arcs were the most interesting and gave weight to their relationships with Buck. Ford in particular and his section of the movie are the best parts. So yes, I think this goes without saying, right? Harrison Ford's a great actor, and by far, he pops up intermittently in the first two acts of the film, getting more prominent as it progresses until the final third of the movie is just him and Buck. Best part of the movie. And it's not even close. Just every scene Harrison Ford is in, he has a magnetism, and just he's a legend, man. Like, would I sit there and say Harrison Ford's one of the top 10 actors of his generation? Probably not. But I'm also not going to pretend that he's not great and that he adds a certain something to every situation that he finds himself in. It's just even in this movie and movies in general, but especially in this movie. And so I really like that because the movie has its most steam when he's on the screen. And I have to give credit to Omar Sy, he's a big black dude. I have not really seen, he looked familiar, but I wouldn't sit there and be like, oh yeah, I know him from this and this. He's one of those, you're that guy from that thing, and I can't quite put my finger on it. And the same thing for Kara G. Francois is Perrault's, I assume, girlfriend or wife. They work this, so basically, right, the movie's broken down into 3 acts, just like every movie does. That's not how I meant to put it. The movie is broken down into overall arc. Buck is this big-ass dog. He is owned by this judge somewhere, I think in Georgia or whatever. He gets dog-napped, and then he ends up, over the course of the movie, he starts off being on a sled team for this, for Perrault's independent mailing service, apparently. He's basically like the UPS of his time. And then we have the second part. It's a very small part, but the second part of the journey that he's on is this like shitty rich prick who is also puts him on his dog sled team, but then does a shitty job and ends up getting in a, just ends up losing his shit. And then it ends with him and John Thornton together, Harrison Ford's character, and it's just what each of these different interactions does to shape Buck as he goes on this, I guess it's a journey of self-discovery. Intermittently in the movie, he'll like look over and see this like embodied version of what I imagine is the aforementioned call of the wild, that animal instinct, that he's being tethered to this way of thinking that he has to be a servant dog, that he has to be owned by somebody, but he's constantly feeling these pangs of what's out there, what's over the horizon. There's a bigger, better life for me outside of this frame of mine that I've been existing in. And that narrative thread carries through the rest of the whole movie. But Omar Sy and Kara G, they play Perrault and Francois. They're the two that own this mail company, and they're really great in the movie. I liked that the humanity they added, the pathos that they added for a role that was basically one note, kind of, in the sense that it didn't really need to be anything more than what it was. I thought that they added a humanity to it, and you felt like Buck would have had a happy life just being that, just being the servant, the leader. He ends up being the leader of this pack of dogs, and they look up to him, and it cuts to them just over a very short amount of time. Perrault and Francois. Buck saves Francois's life. Perrault starts to get really attached, and then that arc ends when, for whatever reason, apparently, Perrault's mail service just gets canceled, and then he has to go back to Quebec, and that's it. But they were good, and Harrison Ford, as I've mentioned already, is also very good. I'm going to get to that other part where he's with the dickhead. I'll get to that. The last thing, unfortunately, that I liked about the movie, it has a really good ending. It ends exactly how you'd expect. Buck ends up over the course of the movie, as it gets closer to the third act, he runs into this white wolf, and it gets involved with her pack of other wolves that she's with, and the movie ends, and he ends up basically starting a family with this wolf and kind of being their den leader, so to speak. And then that's it. He answered the call of the wild. He's his own dog now. He's out there doing his thing. But I liked that. It made sense for him. It showed a trajectory from where we start, where he's like just this judge's dog who is in trouble because he ate all the food at this banquet, and then it ends up with him just out beyond borders, beyond control, beyond the clutches of any shitty dudes trying to do shitty things with him. He's just out there living. And I'm in my late 20s, and as I get older and start trying to get my identity, it's a story that is relatable, right? I mean, who doesn't struggle with, there's this thing out there that's calling me? I found that you are led to happiness when you answer that call, and it's not necessarily the call of the wild, but you understand what I'm saying. It's that thing of, man, if I could just get more of this going in my life, I'd be a lot happier. And it's the way that it convalesces into that ending for Buck, while expected, and I guess it's hard not to from a book that's over 100 years old, and if I've never read the book myself, but I have heard of it and all that. So even if you know where the ending is going, that doesn't mean the ending isn't going to be good. And seeing this journey with Buck and seeing his ups and his downs and where he finally finds his full happiness in accepting that this other life where he's outside and in the woods is what he wants, you can't help but applaud it, because you want that for him. He deserves it. All the shit he's been through, he deserves to be able to do that for himself. So it was a nice, heartwarming conclusion to the story. Now to the cons. The special effects are awful. Buck always looks out of place. The over-reliance of green screen robs the film of its scale. This film is supposed to be set in an unspoiled section of Alaska, but it never escapes looking and feeling like a soundstage. So yes, if you're new to me reviewing stuff, if you're not, you know, if I'm a stickler about certain things. One of the things is, if the centerpiece of your movie is a particular aspect, that aspect has to be fucking good. Because if it's not, we're all going to come back to why it's distracting and how it's not good. Whether it be a story thread or a filming technique or whatever the case may be. You have to have that part work. The special effects in this movie just didn't. And there are moments, inconsistent will probably be the more accurate breakdown. There are moments you look at Buck and he looks really good. For whatever reason, the moments in the movie where he's wet, where he goes through a river or whatever the fuck. He looks really good. The fur looks matted and appropriate and all that stuff, but it's everything else. He doesn't move right. He doesn't react to things right. He just doesn't. And I understand it's because he's just big ass, doesn't exist in real life, I assume. Although if dogs like that size are running around in people's houses, Jesus Christ, I hope you live in a fucking farm somewhere. But he never felt like he belonged in any scene he was in. And as the movie progressed, I started to notice the dog sled team that he's in, I thought that at least most of those dogs were like real. I think maybe 2 of them were. Because again, you just look at it close enough and it's obvious that it's just this mishmash of shoddily made CGI. If you have a whole movie where the centerpiece is this special effects dog, either put the entire special effects budget into that and have all the other dogs be real, or figure out a fucking way to make the budget better so all the CGI looks good. And on top of all of that, you have that it's supposed to be this beautiful, unspoiled Alaskan wilderness, and every time they have all these shots of like, oh, the camera turns, and you look over the hillside, and there's fucking trees and birds and shit, all I saw was green screen, because it doesn't even look good. Like, if you have all your budget tied up in the special effects, you can't film outside? You couldn't figure out a way to make that happen? Look, I didn't go to film school. This is just me on the outside looking in, but I'm like, I don't feel the scope of something like this. I don't feel... Part of the appeal of the story is the idea of the Call of the Wild. Is you're out and you're out in this place and you're trying to figure out the life that you want to lead, and that you're constantly fighting against this call of just going out there and giving into your basest nature of just wanting to be free. So the fact that a lot of the film, because of the special effects, felt so claustrophobic and tight and stuck, really stuck out to me, because it sapped a lot of the energy from the movie and the story it was trying to tell. Other thing I didn't like, Hal as a villain was completely out of place. He is a complete contrast to the other people around him. He goes from this rich idiot who doesn't know a thing about prospecting to this grizzled survivor capable of tracking and eventually finding John's cabin in a matter of what seems to be days. He doesn't come across as menacing, he comes across as a plot contrivance and a fool. So, Hal is the second guy that I mentioned briefly in my plot breakdown, right? So, after Perrault and Francois leave town, Buck and the rest of the dogs are at this like pound basically, until this rich dude walks up, Hal, and goes, hey, hello, and he has like the typical fucking one of those like videos from back in the day, or like those pictures of like the 2 guys with the shitty mustaches putting up their dukes fighting like in, downtown London. That dude sounded like atypical mid-century douchebag. So credit to him, I guess, for holding that down. But his character, from the moment you see him, you're like, asshole. And so he shows up on screen and he's like, yes, I'm going to buy all these dogs and they're going to lead my sled team and I'm going to go find gold. And it's him, it's his wife, fully in like a dress, as if she's on her way to the dance, and then like an assistant who doesn't have any lines at all. And then he's going to go, he's like, I'm going to go from immediately having these dogs to just leaving town. And then that's the scene where John comes in, Harrison Ford's character, and he's like, hey man, probably not a good idea what you're doing. These dogs you got too much shit on the sled. Now's not a good time to cross the river. It's going to probably break up because it's hot outside. Maybe don't go there for right now. And Hal acts like a fucking dickhead and tells him to fuck off or whatever. And they go out of their way to make sure we understand, in case you couldn't tell by the way he's dressed and the way that he sounds, that this guy is an asshole. So Buck leads the dogs to this edge of the river, and the whole time Hal's being a dick. There's a throwaway line. His woman's like, well, maybe we should have fed them. Like, I'm sure there were people that illogical in real life, but even I have a hard time believing that this rich guy, would come to town and bring his woman with him who's in a dress. It's like they're just going to cross halfway across the plain in a couple of hours and be rich as fuck. No. How would you look at that situation and be like, yeah, this is probably going to be a way to do it? When I played the Oregon Trail game, the hardest game I ever played, fuck Dark Souls and all the other shit, the Oregon Trail, even I knew at 8 years old when we were playing it in class that there were certain decisions that you couldn't make because little bubbles would pop up. Hey, if you don't cross the river by spring, you're fucked. And sure as shit, you got to the river by spring and you were fucked because you ain't getting to cross the motherfucker unless you want to lose half your crew. And believe me, whatever the dysentery didn't get, the river crossing got everybody else. So the fact that I would know that, being my age at the time that the game came out, and I'm supposed to believe that this adult person who was smart and savvy enough, you presume, to have amassed this fortune wouldn't already know ahead of time that this is not the best approach. You couldn't have found a more compelling way to make him menacing. And again, I understand the book is written in 1903, but this is 2020. What was menacing and believable in 1903 would probably not cut the mustard now. Just like that phrase I just said. What the fuck did that come from? So it's distracting. And then so he goes from that, and obviously disaster strikes. It happens off screen for some weird reason. But basically they get to this crossing. Jon shows up and he's like, hey, don't beat on Buck anymore. And he just detaches Buck from the rest of the dog sled, and Hal's like, fuck you, I'm gonna get my gold. And then he crosses the river. And then a couple scenes later, Jon is hanging out at the bar with Buck, and then Hal walks into town all pissed. He's like, I lost everything, you piece of shit. And then just starts trouble. And then from that moment on, Hal becomes the bad guy. They have shots intermittently where Hal's like, he goes to Jon's cabin after Jon like is going through his own struggle. His son died recently. And so him and Buck are hanging out. He's like, you know what? I'm going to go on one last adventure in memory of my son. And he plots out this uncharted location on the map. He has an actual map of his own. And then he unfurls part of it and then just crosses off a place on like the wood floor of his cabin. And it's like, we're going to go here where there are no maps. Let's go. And then he gets his shit together. A couple scenes later, Hal shows up with a gun. He's pissed. He's about to make Jon fucking pay in blood for warning him not to cross the river. But I did it anyway, so I'm mad. Cool. And then he walks in, looks at the map that Jon left on the floor for some reason. I don't know why you leave a map on the floor when there's no GPS or whatever the fuck, but fine, because plot. Jon walks in, looks at the map that he has compared to the one that Jon left on the floor. His eyebrows raise, and he's like, oh, I know where they're going. And then the scene cuts, and you don't see him again until the end of the movie where he confronts Jon, and, they had their whole thing. We're supposed to believe, not only is, let's pretend that we've jumped logic, and let's just assume this guy, Hal, who you've introduced as the villain very heavy-handedly, let's assume that he is this rich idiot that doesn't know what the fuck he's doing, isn't a survivor, fine. Why am I supposed to then accept that reality? And in the same reality, acknowledge that he would go from being a bumbling idiot to then being some grizzled survivor who's just going to make his way through the woods. It's established early on that this is not an easy trek for Jon or for Buck to make. They end up taking a canoe over some river rapids, and it's a whole thing. But Hal is able to make this trip no problem? Okay. So he was so weirdly out of place in the rest of the movie, where everybody else seemed realistic in the context of the movie. Hal was such a cartoonishly ridiculous dude. They could have just not had him again in the movie, and it would have been fine. Or they could have made some different choices. Maybe he's a guy from Jon's past. There could have been some context to add to this to make him more interesting, more menacing. But he just came across as he was like Wile E. Coyote chasing the fucking Roadrunner around. And like, dude, this isn't going to work for you, man, and I don't care what you're doing. The other thing I didn't like, and this is probably the biggest problem I had overall, goddamn movie is boring. Too many scenes in the movie drag on. The mail delivery montage, the fight between Buck and the head of the dog sled team, the scenes where Buck hangs out with the wolves. Also, the movie just lacks a certain energy the whole time and just felt like a slog. It's hard to explain, but when you're sitting in a movie, it's just like when you do anything else. You see a play, you see a concert, you know very early on if there's some energy that just is not there, that just distracts from what you're doing and your enjoyment of it. And this movie had that. And I try to go into every movie. Look, I try my best to go into every movie with the hope that it's going to be good. Because is it fun to shit on bad movies? Yeah, of course it is. But it's just like it's fun to talk about movies that are great. But when there's a lack of energy in a movie, it makes watching it really difficult for me. And it was hard for me. And it was disappointing because, like I said, the energy that Harrison Ford brings to the scenes that he's in, I don't know if it's because I like Harrison Ford so much or whatever the case may be, but he carries this fucking movie. I wish the movie was they easily could have taken that arc and spread that out across maybe an hour and a half of the runtime. And that would have been fine. That would have been there is a better movie in here, but instead of making that movie, they made this movie where we have to walk lockstep with the plot of a book that came out many, 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 many years ago and not make any interesting changes. And I'm assuming that just having watched the movie. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I get people are going to watch the movie and I can't believe they did that. In the book, they didn't do any of that. Oh, but whatever. But it was just boring. And like the scenes that drag on, like the male montage, like very early they show that Buck like is trying to take charge and like being the head of the dog sled team. That I do not need to watch. It's not like a Rocky training montage where, yeah, they're kind of corny and cheesy because it's the 80s and whatever. But the way the music is kicking and you are supporting Stallone and Rocky and you want him to win whatever, you're hyped for those moments. Your blood starts to boil. You're like, fuck yeah, he's going to whoop somebody's ass in the ring. I weirdly did not get the same response from watching a bunch of dogs deliver mail in the snow. There's only so many different ways of, oh, yep, it's still cold. Oh, yep, there he goes. He's still cold over there. Yep. I think that montage went on for what felt like 20 minutes. I think it was maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but it just felt like, guys, we get it. We get it. Buck is getting a hold of being the head of the dog sled team. And then that whole transition. When Buck gets found by Francois and Perrault, he's not the head of the team. He's just a dog. Perrault sees him and is like, fuck, you're a big dog. I'll buy you. And there's some tension between Buck and the head of the team, whose name escapes me. I don't care. And boy, let me tell you, I did not realize how much I appreciate talking animals in a movie until there's a bunch of animals in a movie and no one is talking. Because there's the scenes where it's like non-verbal communication, where it's like Buck interacting with the dogs, slowly winning them over until eventually he has a showdown with the head, like, sled dog. They're so goddamn boring. Because sometimes Harrison Ford will come in and be like, but you see, when he's not talking, you're waiting. You're like, Jesus, can somebody please talk? Can something happen? Because this is some nature documentary shit that I have no interest in watching. And they lean into that hard, like the fight goes on for like, again, what feels like 20 minutes. I think it's maybe a 5 or 10 minute scene. It shouldn't feel like that. It's supposed to be a key moment in Buck's development, going from the guy who's just there to the guy who finally steps up and takes his place as the leader. And it just feels sapped of any kind of emotion or energy or me giving a shit because of the way that they dragged this shit on. It was ridiculous. They didn't have any they had music, but the music was so meh and boring. I didn't give a fuck because I was just, my eyes. I'm like, guys, you gotta move this along. I mean, the big fight between Scar and Simba and Lion King didn't take more than 30, 45 fucking seconds. They had a couple lines in between that made that moment, because it built up to that showdown, matter. This didn't fucking matter. It's a no-name dog up against Buck. All right. And then, what else? And then the scenes of them hanging out with the dogs, again, the wolves. It's like, again, we get it. Like, there had to have been a way to engender those moments with some kind of life, and they just didn't. It's as if they just presumed that your attachment to Buck and the animation of the CGI team would be enough for you to feel emotionally invested in this journey. Full disclosure, I don't dislike animals, but I'm not one of these, I'm going to make an Instagram account for my cat type of people either. That being said, my cat does have an Instagram account. I said it as a joke, and my girlfriend actually made one, and in case you're wondering, yes, because he is cuter than I am, he does have more followers. So, Milo the Kitty 19, I think it is. So whatever. So go ahead and give him a like and a follow right after you like and follow me. But I could not get, overall, the problem I had with Hal, the problem I had with the special effects, I could not get over this sense of this is boring. And even though Harrison Ford's scenes finally spark the movie and things start moving in the direction of where they should have moved, where he's finally moving closer to being in the wild and answering that call that he has, by then I was already sapped of any interest. I'm like, I don't fucking care anymore. Can we just be done? So here are my final thoughts. The push and pull between the life you know and the life you want has been a foundation of many classic stories over the centuries, as it is a struggle that many can identify with. A pity, then, that this recent adaptation of the 1903 novel is such a bore. A completely rote and laughably out-of-place villain, crappy CGI, and a remarkably uninspired plot are too much for a great performance from Harrison Ford and a solid ending to overcome. This dog should be put to sleep. 4 out of 10. And I know that's a harsh score, but look, it's just not a good movie. Just don't watch it. Maybe read the book a couple more times. I don't know. But it's not a good... I didn't enjoy it. So, maybe if you love dogs and this is more your shit, like if you sat there and said, man, a dog's purpose made me cry, maybe this movie is more for those people. But I think if you're going to make a movie about maybe a literary classic, I don't really know much about the book other than it's old. There are better ways to tell that story. There's a good movie in here somewhere. If Harrison Ford and the dog, if they had spent less money on the other shit, maybe gave us montages of the life that he had before and blown out the story with John, maybe give him more backstory and do that and then bring context into the way that their lives have led to this moment that leads into the third act, I would have loved that movie much better. Because that is a story worth telling. This was not. So, 4 out of 10. That's me for the week. That's it from me for now. You can catch me on Thursday for the regularly scheduled episode of Movies of Brando, my podcast where I talk about movies, television, and everything in between. Thank you for joining me now. Your social currency matters to me. You can find me on Instagram at Movies of Brando, on Twitter, Movies Brando, probably saying some inappropriate shit to somebody about something. You can find me on YouTube, which is where you should be watching this now. If you like the podcast version better, you can find me on SoundCloud, Movies of Brando. If you have an iPhone, you can find me on the podcast app in, you guessed it, Movies of Brando. And I have a Facebook page, Movies of Brando. I think you're finding a theme here with the way that I'm trying to market myself. Brand, baby, brand. But that's everything from me. What did you think about Call of the Wild? Am I an asshole? Or just you're a callous piece of shit that doesn't love animals? Fine, I'm sorry I'm not Ace fucking Ventura, Pet Detective, all right? I tried. Okay? I said I go in every movie wanting it to be good. Yeah, I even went into Sonic the Hedgehog, which I gave a 6. A movie I expected to give a 3 or a 4. A better score than I expected. So, you know, a man's heart, I'm like the Grinch. My heart can grow 3 sizes. You just have to give me a reason for me not to steal the Who Hash. This has really gone off the rails. Thank you all for listening. Love y'all. Thank y'all. Good night, everybody.